Hey everyone, welcome to another video, and in this video I want to kind of do a 360 around DNS in Azure. It's a topic a lot of people have kind of asked about. I think there's some confusion about custom DNS and Azure private DNS and public DNS. So I want to really kind of quickly go through those things. But first, as always, if this is useful, please like, subscribe, comment and share. So when we think about DNS, the whole point of DNS is computer systems deal in IP addresses. This could be IPv4, 10.20.30.4, could be IPv6, much bigger. And as humans, we're not really good at that. And so we want to give it a friendly kind of name, like a host name. And the point of DNS is DNS provides that lookup from a host name to an IP address. And there's a whole hierarchy. There's not just a DNS server. There's kind of the root domain servers. We have root hints. We have top level domains like com and net. And then we have authoritative domain servers for parts of the zone. For example, saviltech.com would be a DNS zone. There are a set of servers that host the records for that. And so when we think about Azure, it has capabilities around really two key types of DNS we want. So if I think about DNS services, we often think about, well, there's DNS services that are public. These are hosting records that we want to resolve over the internet. If I go to www.saviltech.com, well, there's a DNS server for saviltech.com that has an alias for www that resolves to some server actually hosting that. And so for the public type services in Azure, and I'm going to go into more detail on this, we can kind of manually create records within the zones that we create. And it supports really kind of the host records, the A or the quadruple A for IPv6, and aliases, CNAME records. So I'm going to manually create those things. And it's kind of a limited set of records that are actually supported. And then we can also think about, well, there's private. And we use private a lot because if we think about our internal systems, it could be my SQL servers, my regular computers. I don't want those records available to the internet. I don't want people maybe to see the servers I have. I don't want them to know my internal IP scheme. And so when we think about the private DNS zone, we're really binding it around virtual networks, VNet, to utilize those. And once again, I can manually create records in these private zones that we're going to create. But also one of the nice things we can have is kind of this auto registration. With auto registration based on the Azure resource name, it'll automatically go and create a record in the private DNS zone. And we do have kind of a full range of records supported. So while it's kind of limited with the public host and aliases, here, well, I can have, yes, I have the host, I have the aliases, I have pointers, I have start of authority, I have MX, service, text. I can have all those different types of records actually available to me. So we have two types. I'm going to focus on the private first, and then at the end I'll quickly talk about the public. Public's really not that exciting. We can create zones, and we can put records in it. When we think about private, we're really focusing around a virtual network. So I can think about, okay, I have a VNet. Now, if we remember, a VNet is essentially one or more CIDR ranges, groups of IP address. And then what we're going to do is we can kind of break up that VNet into multiple subnets. And then I put resources into the subnet. So we can have kind of subnet 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And then what we create inside them are really NICs. We create these kind of network interfaces that sure we kind of attach a VM to that as well. So we have our virtual network. Now at the virtual network level, I can configure what the DNS configuration is. Remember, all resources inside a virtual network use DHCP. I never manually set up the IP configuration. They're going to use DHCP to go and get their configuration. That includes the DNS. So if I think about at the VNet level and what is my DNS configuration, there's kind of a default, and the default is Azure DNS. Or I can do custom. I'm going to come back to custom a bit later. And really that Azure DNS is kind of personified as a special IP address. And it's 168. I'm going to double check this. 63.129.16.16. That IP address is always the same, no matter which VNet. It's always that IP address represents using Azure DNS services. It is not routable. If I had a virtual network peered to on-premises, from on-premises I would not be able to get and use 168.63.129.16. It's also used for sort of guest extension usage, health probing, things like that. But anything within a virtual network can talk to this IP for DNS, and it will use the Azure DNS services. So that's the default, but I could change it. So I have a DNS config at the virtual network level. I can also override it if I wanted to at the NIC level. So I could also do a DNS config here. By default, it's going to use the virtual networks configuration, but I could say, hey, I want to do custom. Maybe it's a special type of virtual machine. Maybe it's doing its own kind of services. Maybe it's a domain controller. I need to control how they point to each other. I never change the config within the guest. If I need to do something special for a particular virtual machine, I can set it at the NIC level. So they're the two places. I can configure it at the virtual network, and I can configure it at an actual NIC itself. Now, if I do nothing else, if I just use the default, there is actually a special type of private zone actually created for me. So it's kind of talked about as this kind of IDNS, this internal DNS, and it's always there. If I go and do custom DNS, if I go and add private DNS zones, doesn't matter what I do, this always exists. So this is automatic. It is free. I'm not paying for this thing. There is no manual record creation. I can't do anything like that. And again, it's created when the VNet is created. And it's a set namespace. So what's happening, this is kind of an internal .cloud.app.net. Anything that is created, any VM that is created within the virtual network will get registered to this internal DNS and get this something.internal.cloudapp.net. Doesn't matter what I do. And that's addressable through that default Azure DNS, that 168.63.129.16. And I can show you this. If I jump over to a virtual machine, this VM is actually using custom DNS. It's not using the Azure DNS. But even though, if I force it, you can see here I'm doing an NS lookup, but I'm specifying 168.63.129.16 as the DNS server to actually go and make this request against. And I'm looking up the name of the VM.internal.cloudapp.net, and it resolves. I could change this to other records that are within the same virtual network. So again, it's not going to span virtual networks, but here I can go and resolve records. So even though I'm using a custom DNS in my setup, which we'll talk about, this always exists. So there's always this internal.cloudapp.net that is based on the Azure resource name. Now, if in the guest OS, I change the guest OS name, it doesn't know that. It's registering the Azure Resource Manager resource name. That's kind of a key important point there. So we have this, I can resolve that. But what if I want some more flexibility? Hey, I don't want to use internal.cloudapp.net. I want to be able to manually create other records as well. I need to resolve to different zones. I want to resolve across different virtual networks. So this is where we come into private DNS zones. So what I can absolutely do is, let's go to orange. I can create a private DNS zone. So I give it a particular zone name, could be like saviltech.net, doesn't matter. And I create that private DNS zone. Now with that private DNS zone, remember, I can create many different types of records. I have a full range, service, text, etc., etc. Now the way I use this zone is I connect virtual networks to it in one of two ways. Remember, all of the VMs automatically registered to that internal.cloudapp.net. I can do that with a private DNS zone. So I could take my virtual network and I could actually go ahead and link it to this private DNS zone. And I could link it for registration. So that's the type of link I'm going to add. Now, a virtual network can only connect to one private DNS zone for registration purposes, i.e. the resources created in that VNet can only auto-register to a single DNS zone. I cannot auto-register to multiple private DNS zones. That's a key point. Now, there might be many other DNS zones. I can create lots and lots of private DNS zones. These are all other private DNS zones. Well, I can also connect a VNet to those for resolution purposes. So there'd be different DNS zones. Maybe that's saviltech.net, maybe that's savtech.org, something widgets.whatever. They're just other zones, but they have records in. I want to be able to resolve records in that DNS zone as well. So my virtual network, I can connect to one DNS zone to create records based on the VMs in my VNet, and only one. But I can actually connect, well, actually it's up to 1,000 private DNS zones as well, just for resolution, i.e. there are other records in there I want to be able to resolve. Now, I might have other VNets. I have another VNet over here. We'll say VNet 2. Absolutely, that could go to the same private DNS zone, and it could use it for registration as well. I can actually have up to 100, so a certain DNS zone can have up to 100 VNets for registration, either automatically registering, and up to 1,000 VNets for just resolution purposes. They just want to go and be able to look up a record and resolve it. So I can have many VNets going to the same zone for registration. I can have other VNets that are connecting to that zone. This is VNet 3, or it's only using it for resolution. You get the point with what I can do. So there might be multiple private DNS zones. Each of them is one DNS zone. saviltech.net, savtech.net, widgets.org, whatever that may be. To one of those, I can register the VMs in that VNet. And let's be super clear. When I'm saying it's kind of VMs, we'll do a different color. So when I'm talking about my VMs for that auto registration, it's anything that uses VMs. So I'm saying VM, that would also include VMs that are in a VM scale set. That would include if it's AKS worker nodes. It would include if it's SQL managed instance. If it is a VM, it will get registered into that. That's kind of the key point. But again, only to one. but I can use others for resolution purposes. That's kind of that key point. So it's all or none. And I should kind of make that as a big point. It's all of them. Big, important start. I cannot say, hey, I want these 10 VMs to register, but not these other 10. It's everything. I cannot have some go to one zone, one to another. It's one private DNS zone for the registration of every VM in the VNet. That's it. I cannot do anything else. Lots of others for resolution purposes. So that's how I can use these private DNS zones. So I'm still configured to just use Azure DNS. I've done nothing else at the VNet or the NIC level. But then I go and create these DNS zones, and then it's a configuration on the virtual network to now connect it to these DNS zones for either auto registration or for resolution. Many of them. Now these private DNS zones, they are global. It can be any region can use it. It can be any sub. It can be any VNet. It can even be any tenant. It is not bound to any particular tenant. As long as I have the right permissions, I can use it. So these things are highly resilient. They're replicated around regions all throughout the world. I don't have to worry about that. And I can have lots of different VNets from all over the place using the same DNS zone so they get consistent resolution, unlike kind of that IDNS, which is per VNet. I couldn't resolve things across different virtual networks. Okay, what about custom? What do we do here? Now, custom could be many things. And I should have pointed out, when I said any VNet, any tenant, I still need permissions on it. I have to have the permissions to go and connect that. Anyone can't just go and bind to my private DNS zone. You have to have rights to actually use that. So custom could be many things. There are huge numbers of different types of DNS server out there. Custom could be bind, for example, Linux, there's many others. It could be Active Directory Domain Services, DNS. It could be Azure AD Domain Services, DNS. That's really the same thing. It's just it's managed. If I use Azure AD Domain Services DNS, I can go into it, I can add records, I can add forwarding, etc., etc. However, if I'm going to do custom, now it's not using the Azure DNS. It's going to use whatever IP addresses I put in. So when I do custom, I put in the IP addresses of the DNS servers. Okay, that's great. But what if I want to actually still use Azure DNS for certain things? Private link is a great example. If I use private link, one of the options is it can go and create the special records in the private link.blob.core.windows, whatever that is, the variant of the DNS zone with the IP address it creates, rather than me having to ordinarily manually create the zone and then manually add the records in my DNS service. I want to use Azure DNS for the private link zones. So how would I do that if I'm using a custom DNS? Now remember, ordinarily with DNS, we have authoritative servers for different zones. And what I could do on my DNS server is, well, I can imagine if I've got my, let's say my DNS server, let's say it's on premises, got my DNS server, I can do forwarding. And forwarding says, hey, look, if you're not authoritative for this zone, if you don't know the answer, rather than doing a recursive lookup where I go and look at the sort of the root domain hints and the root domain servers and the top level domain servers, and I go and I find the right server, if you don't know, just go and forward it to this other person. So maybe I'd say, hey, I'll go and forward the request, if I don't know it, to someone else. Or I can do something called conditional forwarding, which is really the same thing, except that rather than if I don't know the answer, go here, if it's for this zone, go and ask here. So I might say, hey, conditional forward, private link.blob.core.windows.net, go to Azure DNS. Now remember, Azure DNS is personified as this 168.63.129.16. If this DNS service was running in Azure, in an Azure VM, I could absolutely just set the forwarding or the conditional forwarding to 168.63.129.16. And again, if that was in Azure, that could be an Azure VM, that could be Azure AD Domain Services DNS, because it will be able to get to this IP address. And it would then go and resolve, and everything would be happy in the world. Probably not everything happy in the world. But this is on-prem. Remember I said this is an IP address only available within the virtual network. So it has no way to forward to that. So I can't do that. So what I would have to do is I would kind of have to stand up within a virtual network. I would stand up a DNS resolver. It could be a Linux VM, Windows VM, whatever. It would forward to this. And because this is inside the virtual network, it can forward to the 168.63.129.16, which is Azure DNS. So that's how I could do it. If I wanted to be able to forward to Azure DNS, like those private zones, be it private link or just anything else, from an on-premises DNS, I would stand up a little kind of resolver within a virtual network that would take the request. It can then go and query the Azure DNS because it's in the virtual network, in a virtual network, and it would resolve. So that's how I can think about forwarding. Again, because ordinarily this is not routable. I cannot just get to that from an on-premises. I can only get to it within a VNet. Again, if my domain controllers were just sitting in Azure VNet, for example, they could absolutely just forward straight to the Azure DNS, or would be happy and well in the world. So I can absolutely do that then. So that's how I can think about joining those things together. And this is a very common pattern. If I want to be able to get to those like private link records or other Azure private DNS zones, I just stand up a box that can do that resolution. If it was hosted in Azure, I can just go to it directly. So this was all private. This is all within my virtual network. Now, of course, there's public as well. So I can have public DNS zones. So I just go and create these public DNS zones. Again, I manually create the records. If I do this, I have to actually set Azure as the authoritative server for that zone. Just creating a zone doesn't mean the internet will use it. I can create whatever zone I want, but I have to be the owner of that domain and go to the registration body and say, hey, the authoritative DNS servers for this zone are now Azure. And when you create a public DNS zone, it will show you in the properties what the actual DNS servers are that you should configure as authoritative for the zone. So requests on the internet will get recursively forwarded to here so they can get resolved. So that exists, and these are separate. I cannot auto-register to public DNS zones, they're completely different. Now you may have split-brain DNS. Split-brain DNS is where I have the same zone existing in a private and a public. Like I have a saviltech.net public and I have a saviltech.net private, because it may be, hey, I want a public presence for that zone, hosting up here that resolves on the internet. Then I also use that zone for internal things, but I don't want to expose those records to the internet. If you have the same zone, public and private, and I'm on a virtual network that is linked to that private version, well, private trumps public. It's like the old card game when you play top trumps. Trump means it wins. So if there is a zone for private and a zone for public, and the record exists in private, that's the one that's going to get used. So private will always trump public. It's kind of just a key point to understand. Something I should as well point out is, as a completely separate service, of course, there is Azure Traffic Manager. And I talked about this in other videos, but think of Azure Traffic Manager as kind of a global balancer. I can have this name in the Traffic Manager namespace that I could alias to in a validity domain. It can have multiple endpoints, i.e. different services around the world. And then based on the client doing the request, it can resolve maybe to the one that's closest to me, maybe a round robin. This is a completely separate service, but it gives me that ability to have services distributed around the world, and based on DNS will resolve to different possible targets based on information about the requesting DNS server. So that's it. Most of you are probably going to be doing things in the private DNS zones. Just kind of really important point to realize that, hey, I can only auto register to one, and it is everything. Anything that's a VM will register to it, but I can link to many, many others just for resolution purposes. The great thing about these zones, I can link to multiple VNets so they can have a common set of resolution across them. One of the things I can't do today from Azure Private DNS is forward to other DNS servers. That's something that's being worked on. So the whole idea about forwarding from Azure Private DNS and conditional forwarding, those things are being worked on by Microsoft. We expect to see that kind of functionality in the future. So today, if I need a mix of kind of custom DNS and Azure Private DNS zones, I have to use custom DNS as the kind of primary. And then from the custom DNS, from within a resource within Azure, it can then forward or conditionally forward to the 168.63.129.16 that personifies Azure DNS within the VNet to go and then use the private DNS zones. So that was it. There's our kind of sum picture. I hope this was useful. Until next time, take care.